Thank you very much. I want to thank the Soho Forum and also Peter for this cordial debate. I'd also like to begin, as I think is necessary, with the land acknowledgement. The New York City Commission on Human Rights acknowledges the land politically designated as New York City to be the homeland of the Lenape, who were violently displaced as a result of European settler colonialism over the course of 400 years. To suggest that human rights law would permit the Lenape to detonate a suicide vest in Columbia's Butler Library or in this hall would be morally perverse. Peter doesn't mention terrorism. Unfortunately, we can't avoid it. Now, as a historian, I get paid to predict the past, and Peter might suggest I only get that right about half the time. But historically, one of the problems inherent in land disputes is that migrations were constant. Even prior to the arrival of Europeans, Native Americans moved and migrated. War, famine, and environment all caused movements. During World War II, war forced more than 50 million Europeans to leave their homes and resettle elsewhere. Approximately 100,000 came to Palestine. Is Israel a democracy? Yes. Look, we may not like Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He's a cynic, he's arrogant, and I find many of his policies abhorrent. But the outcome of Israeli elections are uncertain until votes are cast. Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, is now 89 years old and in the 20th year of his 4-year presidential term. Suggesting Israel is not a democracy is like suggesting Ukraine is a dictatorship. I won't even begin to talk about Hamas, where at best you have one man, one vote, one time. Now, Israel has a pluralistic political system with 13 parties in parliament, more than most democracies, with a low 3.25% electoral threshold, lower than most democracies, ensuring broad representation, including 2 largely Arab parties, as well as a party that is dedicated to anti-Zionism. The opposition in Israel is active and more powerful than in most Western democracies. Look, some of you know that I have a bounty on my head for having been a little bit too antagonistic to Recep Tayyip Erdogan. A $900,000 bounty on my head. My wife had said that if only he knew that I snored, he could have had me for a lot less. But there's a joke I hear in Turkey about a Turkish professor who makes an unfortunate comment about the president. And he ends up in prison, and he goes into prison. And he's got 20 years because of his tweet or whatever he said. And he goes in with a whole list of books because he's a lot of time on his hands. And the prison librarian looks over the list and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. We don't have any of these books. We only have the authors." That's not the case in Israel, where the opposition is vocal. Israel's liberal Supreme Court frequently rules against the government, demonstrating judicial independence. The protests against judicial reform were protests against a proposal that would have actually brought Israel in line with the United States and most European democracies when it came to confirmation hearings for judges and that sort of thing. There are full civil rights for minorities, Arabs, women, LGBTQ+. Individuals enjoy full rights, often with more protections than in Western countries. Now, make no mistake, I'm in favor of a 2-state solution. Frankly, I believe in a 3-state solution because I think the political cultural gap between the West Bank and Gaza right now is too great to overcome. That's not a bad thing. There's 2 Romanias, one of which is called Moldova. There's 2 Albanias, one of which is called Kosovo, and there's 22 Arab states. Much of the debate about whether Israel is democratic revolves around different regimens in Israel proper versus the disputed territories. The distinction is important as it begs the question, occupied from whom and when? When did the independent state of Palestine exist? Did Jordan and Egypt occupy it prior to 1967? Did the Ottoman Empire occupy it? Who was its founding president and king? It is extraordinarily dangerous to declare a state retroactively in order to declare resistance legal. That said, Israel is not the same as the West Bank or Gaza, nor should it be treated as such. Now, many pundits and politicians say Israel cannot retain both its democratic and Jewish character so long as occupation persists, and then they give demographic statistics to suggest that Israel represents a Jewish minority or soon to be Jewish minority lording over non-Jewish and Arab majority. When Peter and I were at Yale together, Peter Salovey, who would rise to become the university's president, assigned Darrell Huff's 1945 book, How to Lie with Statistics, to force students to analyze critically. While many in the media and activist community take Palestinian statistics at face value, let's look at these statistics. Here are the problems. The Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics counts Jerusalem's population, so Jerusalem is counted twice in these figures. The UN in 2006 assumed natural growth was around 3.5% for Palestinians. The Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics decreed an improbable 6.6%. Nor will Palestinian statisticians accept emigration. Every Palestinian who's left the West Bank or Gaza permanently resides there. If the Middle East, it's the Middle East equivalent of residents of Chicago graveyards finding themselves on voting rolls decades after their deaths. Now let's talk about land use. Problems exist within Israel, but Arabs can buy private land, 7% of the country, or lease state-owned land, 80% of Israel, much like Jews do. The remaining 13% is owned by the Jewish National Fund and is usually just parks or national forests. This simply is not apartheid. To suggest otherwise reflects the triumph of polemic over reality. Indeed, the closest parallel to apartheid in the Middle East exists in Bahrain, where sect determines permissible living areas. Now, when it comes to immigration, Anait Wolf, a former Labor Party MK, member of the Knesset, noted that the lands the United Nations allocated for the Jewish state were those that the early Zionists reclaimed through land purchase and the draining of malarial swamps. The Arab influx from today's Syria coincided with malaria eradication. Now, here's a quote. Since Peter is fond of quotes, I'll give a few. The Arab immigration into Palestine since 1921 has vastly exceeded the total Jewish immigration during the whole period, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt observed on the cusp of World War II. Nor was Roosevelt alone. C.S. Jarvis, the British governor of the Sinai from 1922 to 1936, noted the illegal Arab immigration coming, quote, from not only from the Sinai, but also from Transjordan and Syria. The price of real estate soared, and the British-sponsored Peel Commission reported in 1937 that a shortfall of land is, we consider, due less to the amount of land acquired by Jews than to the increase in the Arab population. Now, historically, no one denies large immigration of European Jews to Palestine beginning in the late 19th century. While the 1948 war led many Arabs to leave Palestine, some by choice and others not, the Arab narrative largely forgets an equal, if not greater, compulsion of Jews to leave Arab countries. As the UN Watch's Hillel Nora once asked before the UN Human Rights Council, Algeria, where are your Jews? Now, if we take the same definition of Palestinian refugee that the United Nations Relief and Works Agency used, and we apply it to the partition of India, then today there are 250 million refugees between India and Pakistan. The fact of the matter is, there is a problem here, but we also need to address it as a problem that exists in much of the rest of the world, as opposed to its own special case. Now, what's unique today, actually, is the number of Palestinians seeking to move into Israel. As peace potentially nears and a division of Jerusalem comes with it, many East Jerusalem Arabs are actually moving to central Jerusalem neighborhoods so they do not lose access to the Jewish state by falling on the Palestinian side of the border. More than 6,000 Lebanese Christian Arabs moved to Israel as Hezbollah took over southern Lebanon in May 2000. How many dictatorships see immigration? How many people immigrate to Turkey or Egypt or Burma or Cuba? How many to apartheid South Africa? Now, Israel's concern with regard to terrorism is real, and it cannot simply be explained away by occupation. In 1946, the Intelligence Office of the Department of War, the predecessor of the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, estimated that the greatest over-the-horizon threats to U.S. national security were communism and Islamist terror. Communism was a given what was going on with the Azerbaijan crisis. Islamist terror, this is before the partition of Palestine. This is before the creation of the State of Israel. What they were looking at was the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, which was running roughshod over Egypt at the time, sparking a lot of violence. The issues ideology, the philosophy of the Muslim Brotherhood, which, by the way, Hamas has evolved from. Now, I feel for Palestinians, but it's condescending to hold them to different standards. It's also condescending to deny them agency for their own actions. Peter focuses his work on Israel and the Palestinians. My work is a little bit broader. I remember visiting Mosul and Raqqa, for example, the capital of the Islamic State in Syria, just after liberation. What I saw was astounding. What I saw were ruins. I mean, driving into Raqqa, Syria, I was passing kilometers and kilometers and kilometers of destroyed buildings. And when I would interview people in Raqqa, they didn't say to the Americans who were involved in that urban warfare, why didn't you pause? Why didn't you provide food to the Islamic State? Urban warfare there's no magic solution here. But we need to recognize that what we see with regard to Gaza has its roots in the same problem that we saw with regard, for example, to the Islamic State. Now, it's also wrong to say this is a noxious ideology, but they control land. We just need to deal with it. Thank God the world didn't say that when it came to the Khmer Rouge. And while we're talking about Nobel Prize winning human rights organizations, let's not forget that the American Friends Service Committee actually endorsed the Khmer Rouge and said all this about killing fields was just capitalist propaganda. This is in Gwenter Louis' book on the politics of pacifism. The fact of the matter is that sometimes human rights groups can get things wrong or can be guided more by the politics than the principle. Now, prior to Hamas's October 7th, 2023 attack on Israel, and that was during a ceasefire, no less. Let's not forget that. Life in Gaza was not easy, but also let's not exaggerate. According to the CIA's World Factbook for 2023, life expectancy for Gaza was well above the world average and also above Serbia, Egypt, Colombia, Kazakhstan, and South Africa. Infant mortality was less than in Egypt, Turkey, Morocco, and South Africa. Unemployment was bad, but still better than in South Africa and Kosovo. There are more mobile phones than in Puerto Rico or Bosnia. Ditto internet access. Simply put, there's no systematic oppression of Palestinians. Their own leadership is responsible. Palestinians govern themselves. In the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestinians are ruled by the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, both of which are known for suppressing free speech, jailing dissidents, and canceling elections. Peace, rejection, and terrorism matters. The Palestinian Authority has rejected multiple peace offers, including Camp David in 2000 and then in 2008, where they would have had not only a state, but more than 100% of the territory of the West Bank and Gaza when land swaps were taken into account. The claim that Gaza is a prison is false. Gaza has a border with Egypt, yet Egypt keeps it closed due to Hamas's terror activities. Israel withdrew fully from Gaza in 2005, but instead of building a prosperous state, Hamas destroyed Israeli-built greenhouses and turned Gaza into a terror base. Look, Peter's been to Gaza more than I have. I've been to Gaza in the West Bank, but when I was in Gaza, I didn't see, nor was I shown by those with whom I was with, the terror tunnels, which are actually longer, more extensive than the North Vietnamese tunnel system. You can't say that you can't assume that you're getting the straight truth from your interlocutors if somehow they miss the fact that underneath the hospitals, underneath the schools, are 300 miles worth of tunnels, which are being used as bomb factories or to keep women and children prisoner. The claim of Israeli racism is also a lie. Israel's strong relations with Arab nations, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, Egypt, and Jordan, all of which they have peace with right now. Arabs in Israel have full rights and political freedoms. They serve as diplomats, scientists, doctors, actors. Now, those who aren't under Israeli law, that's because Israel doesn't recognize them as part of Israel. The whole point of the Oslo process was to have Palestine become independent, to have that two-state solution. And if it weren't for the terrorism, we would be much closer there. Now, look, I've spent time in South Sudan, which is a mess. But I've also spent, and I took my 9-year-old daughter with me on one of these trips, to Somaliland, which doesn't get any international assistance. And yet, and we give $2 billion plus to Somalia. Somaliland is thriving. It's got the second largest Coca-Cola bottling plant in Africa. It's got now, according to the World Bank, one of the best, most efficient deep water ports. It's got 99% penetration of mobile money. The fact of the matter is that people have agency. When I'm in Al Anbar, you guys remember Fallujah and Ramadi? When I'm in Al Anbar, it's glistening like Iraqi Kurdistan. And let's talk about Iraqi Kurdistan, which is how, when Peter was my editor for the new, when he was my editor and I was contributing to the New Republic, in Iraqi Kurdistan, you had embargoes by Saddam Hussein, you had embargoes by the United Nations, but the Kurds decided on their own to build up their society rather than spend the money on terror. We have to look at reality in this regard. Now, with that, I think I've been a little bit provocative. Peter certainly has as well, but why don't I turn the floor back over?